Welcome to this episode of Psoriasis Uncovered, a podcast series produced by the National Psoriasis Foundation, the nation's leading organization for individuals living with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. Join us to hear our guest speakers uncover topics that lead to a better understanding of the disease and management, to coping and thriving with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis.
Welcome to Psoriasis Uncovered. My name is Jeff Brown, and I'll be your moderator for this episode sponsored by Organon, where we'll discuss the use of biosimilars from the perspective of dermatologist Dr. James Song and a patient who currently uses a biosimilar as treatment for psoriatic disease, Ana Rinck. Dr. Song is the Director of Clinical Research at Frontier Dermatology Partners, where his clinical interests include psoriasis and other skin diseases. He is also a member of NPF's Medical Board. Ana owns her own private consulting business and is an operations and project manager. Welcome, Dr. Song and Ana. It's a pleasure having you here today. Since some of our listeners may have heard about biosimilars but are not quite sure what they are, Dr. Song, can you please define what is a biosimilar versus what is a biologic?
I think the simplest way to think about the difference here is to compare it to something like aspirin. We call that a small molecule. If you wanted to make aspirin, it's actually pretty straightforward. You just need to follow a recipe, and if you follow it to a T, you can make an identical replica of aspirin, which is why generics that are identical do exist for small molecules. When you compare it to a biologic, right, by definition, a biologic is derived from a living organism. It is far more complex. We're talking orders of magnitude more complex. So if I were to say that making aspirin is like putting together a tricycle, making a biologic, it's like putting together a spaceship. I mean, that is the difference of complexity here. And that is because even if you know what the end product of a biologic should look like, all the intermediate steps that get to that end product is somewhat of an unknown, and it's being made in a living environment. And what's interesting is that even with the original brand name biologic, with the same factories and the same cell lines that you're using, there still is batch-to-batch variation. So even within the brand name biologics, there are differences within the manufacturer. That being said, a biosimilar, for all intents and purposes, will behave and function like a brand biologic, right? In order for a biosimilar to get that designation from the FDA, it is a very rigorous testing protocol that needs to be undergone in order for you to get that stamp of approval. So the FDA is looking at the function, the structure, how does it behave in the human body? How does your body behave against that biosimilar? And it's really the totality of evidence that the FDA will use to decide whether we will approve this biosimilar. So it's not just one attribute, but it's all the attributes in totality.
So, Dr. Song, what biosimilars are currently available in comparison to the reference product or biologic? And can they be used in combination with other treatments?
There's a lot of biosimilars now that we are starting to get approved, which is a good thing. Last time I counted, it's like 24. The majority of them are in what we call the TNF alpha inhibitor class, but we also have quite a few in the IL-12/23 class. As far as who you can use this in and how you can use it, it's pretty much what you would have done with the original bio-originator drug or the brand name biologic. So however you would use that brand name biologic, you should think about the same way with a biosimilar, right? So if you were using it with a topical therapy or an oral therapy or combining it with phototherapy, you can do the exact same thing with the biosimilar. Now, amongst the biosimilars, there are still some tiny differences that I think are important to note. First is that the device, the injector, can be a little bit different from one biosimilar to the next. The concentration can also be different as well. So we know with the TNF alpha inhibitor class, there's two different concentrations. Some will have the higher concentration, the others won't, which means you have to use two of the pens. And then also whether some will have a buffer like citrate and others won't. But all that being said, you should be thinking about the biosimilar and using the biosimilar the exact same way that you would be using the bio-originator.
So, Dr. Song, what does the term interchangeable mean, and what does that mean for someone like Ana?
Interchangeability is yet another designation by the FDA. Not all biosimilars will have this. And in order to prove interchangeability, you have to do a separate study showing that if you start with the bio-originator and then you switch to the biosimilar, then you switch back to the bio-originator and you do this back and forth, is that still safe and effective for the patient? And you'll compare that to patients who started on the bio-originator and stayed on the bio-originator. If you can prove that, then you get the interchangeability designation. If you get that, then for a patient, what that really means is that a pharmacist could change the original prescription, which may have been for the bio-originator, and swap it for the biosimilar, even without getting approval from a prescriber, right? Now, the designation is determined at the federal level, but it's ultimately at the state level that decides whether that substitution could happen unilaterally or whether it still requires a prescriber's approval to make that switch.
That's great information. Thank you. So, Anna, tell us a little bit more about yourself. We know you're currently on a biosimilar. When were you diagnosed with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis? And how did you treat your disease in the past?
Thank you, Jeff. So I was diagnosed with psoriasis in 2009 after dealing with symptoms for a few years. I have a darker skin tone, so it's harder to diagnose than someone that's a typical skin tone. So it was kind of challenging to get there. For a long time, I managed with topicals and intralesional injections. I used to be very intimidated by biologics, so I wanted to keep it on the back burner just in case. But then when in 2018, I got diagnosed with psoriatic arthritis, I didn't want to wait for my joints to be damaged any further, so I became really open to thinking about biologics. I first tried an injectable TNF inhibitor, and unfortunately, I had to stop during the induction because I became allergic to it. So my rheumatologist switched me to a different TNF inhibitor injection. I was on that one for a couple of years. And after that, we moved to a weight-based dose infusion TNF. And I was on that for a few years. I had some vascular access issues for a while. And so my rheumatologist recommended a different class of medicine. I went to an injectable IL-17A inhibitor. And unfortunately, that medicine took me out of remission. So after I was able to get a portha cath on my chest, I went back to my infusions. It's been great so far. I have no complaints about it.
So, Anna, I'm curious how you ended up on a biosimilar. For me, my insurance company moved me to a biosimilar as a cost-cutting measure. Did you have an opportunity to speak with your dermatologist or rheumatologist about your treatment options? And if so, what was that conversation like?
I actually did not get to have a conversation, neither with my dermatologist or rheumatologist. It was something that my insurance made unilaterally. So there was no discussion with my providers. It was more like, okay, here's the letter, and off we went.
I had a similar situation with my insurance. Originally, I had the option of moving from a name brand to a biosimilar, and after a year or two, they made that decision that I had to. So, similar story for me as well. So, Dr. Song, what is that conversation like when you initiate the discussion about options when a treatment is no longer effective? And do you include biosimilars as an option?
Yeah, absolutely. If a patient is on a particular biologic and they're no longer responding to it, we call that a secondary non-responder. So it tells us that maybe the body is getting used to that particular drug, but it also allows us to maybe stay within the class of medication if we need to, opposed to having to switch to a completely different class of medication. Now, for all intents and purposes, like we said, biosimilars are very, very, very similar to the bio-originator. So if a patient isn't doing as well with the bio-originator, making a switch to the biosimilar probably isn't necessarily the first thing I would do. It's not to say it's off the table, but you have to understand why you would want to switch to a biosimilar. If a patient has, let's say, both psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, like Ana does, and we felt that the TNF inhibitor class is going to be the best class for her joints and her skin, then we are going to try to stay in the class. And whether that means we switch to another TNF inhibitor versus going to a biosimilar of that bio-originator, I'm probably going to favor going with a non-biosimilar in that particular instance. However, if a patient, let's say, had tolerability issues, every time they gave themselves an injection, they got a bad injection site reaction, but otherwise their skin and joints were doing well, then I don't think it's unreasonable to switch to a biosimilar version of the bio-originator.
And Anna, given what you said earlier, how did you feel about the change in treatment initiated by the hospital? Were you aware of the change in advance?
Like I said previously, they sent me a letter and informing that it was supposed to happen. And I think it was in between infusions, so it kind of worked out for me. Honestly, every time you change treatments, whether it's because you want to or because someone else wants you to do that, it's kind of nerve-wracking a little bit. You're always having questions in the back of your head. It's going to have weird side effects. Am I going to get out of remission or things like that?
Yeah, those are good considerations. And did you notice any difference in the effectiveness or cost of treatment with the change from the biologic to the biosimilar?
I did not experience any difference in cost of treatment. My treatments are slightly a little more expensive because now I have a port and there's a cost with accessing the port. But medicine wise, it's basically the same cost. It's also been working really well for me. I'm like, success story. It's the same cost of medicine. Like doctor said, it works really good. And that's why I've been on it for so many years.
That's great to hear. I know for me as well, there was no cost difference. Both the biosimilar and the name brand biologic had a copay sharing program. So I didn't incur any cost when I had to transition over. It was just signing up for a new program. So, Dr. Song, on October 29th, the FDA announced it will be taking action to help make the development process for biosimilars faster and less costly by proposing updates to simplify studies and reduce clinical testing. They also plan to make it easier for biosimilars to be developed as interchangeable. What do you think is the significance of this development for biosimilars? Do you think insurance carriers may be more willing to cover biosimilars if the result is lower prescription costs?
Yeah, I think those changes are necessary. And I just want to be very clear here. These changes are not a sign that the FDA is having any less of a rigorous or stringent standard for drug approval. They're just trying to remove some of the redundancies and inefficiencies so that it allows us to bring these drugs to the market more quickly. And it also incentivizes more companies to invest in this space. The reality in treating psoriasis today in 2026 isn't so much an issue of not having enough good options. We actually have a lot of good options. It's the issue of access to patients who otherwise can't afford these medications. And so it's more of an equity issue. And if you look at the dollars that we're spending, the net drug spending costs in the US alone, while biologics take up just a fraction of the total prescriptions, they make up a majority of the drug costs. And this is quite frankly not sustainable. And as an insurance company, you're going to have to decide what medications you can offer and which ones you have to cut. The hope is that as we make it easier for companies to bring biosimilars to the market, that's going to encourage more competition. More competition is going to drive down costs. And if it gets cheaper, the hope is that it will get easier for patients to get onto these biosimilars. More companies or insurance plans will offer them, and that it won't be as difficult to get onto these medications because some plans have very strict requirements of what you have to try and how bad of a disease you need to have before you qualify for a biosimilar. And the hope is that as we get lower cost drugs, that's going to get easier as well. And you mentioned the interchangeability piece, and I think this is so important because both you, Jeff, and Ana have mentioned this. The idea of switching to another medication, even if it's supposed to be a similar medication, is still a very scary and unnerving experience for the patient. It's the unknown. But the interchangeability studies is really trying to address that very concern, is that if I'm doing well on this particular bio-originator, what's going to happen if I switch to a biosimilar, right? That's the most important question we have. And that's why these studies and this designation is going to be so important to give confidence to our patients that yes, for the vast majority of cases, we can make that switch successfully.
Thank you, Dr. Song. That was a great answer. This is definitely a topic that will continue to develop as we move forward. Anna, what suggestions can you offer someone who may be considering a biosimilar as a treatment option?
I'd say the big one is ask all the questions. Don't be afraid to be that annoying patient that has a million questions because overall, this is going to go inside your body and it might have a great effect and keep you in the same maybe remission that you were before, or it could go the other way. And like it happened to me when I have switched classes. And so asking all the questions and having someone that you can rely on for those things are great. Providers that are open to answering said questions. But also, don't forget about the National Psoriasis Foundation. In my case, the help that I've gotten from the foundation's been invaluable. And whenever someone tells me that they've been just diagnosed with psoriasis, that's the one place where I send everyone.
Those are great suggestions, Ana. I agree. As a patient, you want to have faith in your treatment, faith in what you're taking, talking to your doctors, doing research on good source of information like the NPF website. Those are all good ways to feel confident about the steps forward. So Ana and Dr. Song, thank you both for being here to help expand our knowledge about biosimilars. It's helpful to hear your perspectives about using biosimilars. Do you have any closing comments to offer our listeners today? We'll start with you, Dr. Song.
I said this before, but we are living truly in a golden era of psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis, where we have so many wonderful options now, and we are so fortunate. But the hope and the promise of biosimilars is that this will allow more equitable access to these medications. And there's already a precedent for this. If you look outside of the US, biosimilars have really become the standard of care, and we've seen wide use adoption across different patients, plans, and we're just seeing overall that more and more patients are able to benefit from these medications. So I am optimistic that eventually in the US, we will get there too. But I just want to, again, make it very clear that a biosimilar is not inferior to a bio-originator. It behaves just like this drug, and I would use them interchangeably and in the appropriate patient.
I do want to thank you both for having me. It's exhilarating to be able to give the patient's point of view. And yeah, so thank you.
Well, thank you both for your time today.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ana and Dr. Song, for being here today to discuss biosimilars, which we'll continue to hear more about in the future. If you would like to learn more about biosimilars, visit our website at psoriasis.org/biosimilars or contact the National Psoriasis Foundation's Patient Navigation Center by email at education@psoriasis.org to request the Biosimilars Quick Guide. And finally, thank you to Organon, who provided support on behalf of this program activity.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of Psoriasis Uncovered for people living with psoriasis and psoriatic arthritis. If you or someone you love has ever struggled with psoriatic disease, our hope is that through our podcast you'll gain information that inspires you to lead a healthy life and look to the future. Please share the episode link if the content in today's episode will benefit someone you know. You can find this or all future episodes of Psoriasis Uncovered on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, Ghana, Pandora, iHeartRadio, and the National Psoriasis Foundation webpage. To learn more about this topic or others, please visit psoriasis.org or contact us with your questions or comments by email at podcast@psoriasis.org.